There was a year when the sun stopped giving light. Not a sunset, not an eclipse. A dimming that lasted 18 months, over an entire hemisphere. And no one alive at the time knew why. The people who lived through it wrote it down in the plainest words they had. The sun shone, but it gave no warmth. It hung in the sky like a pale coin, day after day. And the world underneath it began to starve. This is not a myth. It is one of the best documented disasters in human history. And it happened to your ancestors in the year 536. You have probably never heard of it. That's the strange part. We remember the plagues that killed millions and the wars that redrew maps. But the single worst stretch of years a person could have been born into left almost no mark on the stories we tell ourselves. Ask most people to name the worst time to be alive, and they'll reach for the Black Death, or the trenches, or some more recent horror. They'll almost never reach for this. But one historian will. Michael McCormick, who studies the ancient past at Harvard, has said plainly that 536 was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. Full stop. And he isn't guessing. The evidence is written into tree rings, into glaciers, and into the panicked words of people who watched the sky go wrong and had no science to explain it. Start with those people. In the Eastern Roman Empire, a writer named Procopius recorded what he saw with an unease you can still feel across 15 centuries. The sun, he wrote, gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, through that entire year. He described a fear that spread as the cold deepened, a sense that something fundamental had broken and might not be fixed. He wasn't writing poetry. He was writing a weather report from the edge of a catastrophe. And the strangeness didn't stay in one place. Snow fell in summer in China. Crops failed in Ireland. Drought gripped parts of the Americas. A cold fog settled over the Middle East and refused to lift. Whatever had happened, it had happened to the whole top half of the planet at once. So what did happen? For a long time, no one could say. The accounts were dismissed as exaggeration, the ramblings of a superstitious age. The middle of the 6th century sat inside what people used to call the Dark Ages, and this seemed like just one more dark chapter with no clear cause. Then the trees started talking. Trees keep a diary. Every year they grow, they lay down a ring, and the width of that ring records the kind of year it was. A warm, wet, gentle year leaves a fat ring. A cold, brutal, sunless year leaves a thin one, sometimes barely there at all. A researcher named Mike Bailey, studying ancient Irish oaks, found something disturbing in the wood from this period. Around 536, the rings almost vanish. The trees had nearly stopped growing, and it wasn't one bad summer. It was several, stacked back to back, a run of years so cold the forests themselves went quiet. That pattern showed up everywhere researchers looked. Oaks in Europe, pines in Scandinavia, the same thin, starved rings at the same time, across thousands of kilometers. The trees agreed with Procopius. Something had reached up and dimmed the sun. The final answer came out of the ice. In places like Greenland and the Swiss Alps, snow that fell centuries ago is still there, pressed into deep layers, each one sealing in a record of what was in the air that year. A team led by the glaciologist Paul Majewski and Michael McCormick drilled into a glacier and sliced it thin enough to read season by season. And in the layers from the mid-530s, they found it. A massive spike of volcanic fallout. Sulfur, ash, the chemical signature of an eruption, violent enough to punch a veil of dust into the upper atmosphere and hang it there, between the planet and the sun, It wasn't one eruption. It was a cluster. A colossal blast early in 536, then another around 540, then a third near 547. 3 hammer blows in barely a decade, each one refreshing the veil before the last could clear. Each one dropping global temperatures further. Summer temperatures in Europe may have fallen by more than 2 degrees, which sounds small until you remember that a farming society lives and dies inside those 2 degrees. And here is where the story stops being about a single terrible year and becomes something far heavier. Because it didn't end. In 2016, the climate scientist Ulf Büntgen and his colleagues put a name to what the tree rings and ice cores were describing. They called it the Late Antique Little Ice Age. And it did not last a season or a year. It lasted, by their reckoning, from 536 to around 660. In parts of Central Asia, longer still. Stop on that number for a moment. More than a century of cold. Think about what that means for a single human life. If you had been born into this, you would not have lived through a disaster and come out the other side. You would have been born under a dimmed sky, grown up under it, raised your own children under it, and died still under it. The cold was not an event you survived. It was the entire shape of your existence. Your grandparents would have told you stories of a warmer world, and you would have half believed them, the way you might half believe a story about a golden age you never saw. An entire lifetime. That is the part that's hard to hold in your head. We are built to understand storms, floods, single bad years. We are not built to understand a winter that outlives the people who remember its beginning. And the cold did not come alone. Within a few years of that first dimming, a plague tore through the Mediterranean. The pandemic history remembers as the plague of Justinian. It struck a population already weakened by failed harvests and hunger, already thinned and frightened, and it killed on a scale that helped tip the Eastern Roman Empire into a decline it never fully reversed. Famine, then disease, then collapse, all downstream of a sky that had gone quiet. So who lived? That is the question that matters. And it's the same one that echoes through every one of these ancient catastrophes. Because someone did. You are proof of it. The line that leads to you threaded straight through the worst century anyone had ever recorded. And it did not break. The people who survived were not the ones who understood what was happening. Nobody understood. They had no word for volcano, in the sense we mean it. No way to connect a mountain on the far side of the world to the frost killing their wheat. They survived without an explanation, which may be the hardest kind of survival there is. What they had instead was adaptation, and it was rarely heroic. In colder regions, communities that leaned on hardier crops, the grains that could tolerate a short, cold growing season, held on where wheat farmers starved. Groups that could move, moved. Some of the great migrations of that era, the reshuffling of peoples across Europe and Asia, that historians once explained through politics alone, looked different once you know the climate underneath them. People were not just chasing land or fleeing armies. They were following food and warmth across a continent that had turned hostile. And a great deal of survival came down to something even less dramatic than migration. It came down to the ones who kept planting, who kept the seed grain back even when they were hungry enough to eat it, so there would be something to sow next spring, even if next spring was as grey as this one. Who kept the knowledge alive of how to store food, how to ration, how to hold a community together when despair would have been easier. There is no monument to those people, but every family that made it through was carried by someone doing exactly that, one lean year after another. There is also a colder truth buried in the record, the kind these disasters always seem to carry. Survival was uneven, and much of it came down to where you happened to be standing. Two families of the same people, living through the same century of cold, could face entirely different fates depending on their soil, their altitude, their distance from the coast, their luck with a single failed harvest. Some regions cooled hard and emptied out. Others, sheltered by geography, cooled a little and carried on. There was no fairness in it. The dimmed sun did not choose the deserving. It simply fell unevenly across a world that had no idea why, and the survivors were, as often as not, the ones the damage happened to miss. Researchers now suspect this uneven pressure reshaped whole populations. The cold may have pushed some groups toward each other and pulled others apart, mixing languages and bloodlines in ways that still show up faintly in the ancestry of people living in those regions today. A disaster that no one at the time could name still managed to edit the human family, quietly, over 4 or 5 generations. This is the pattern that keeps repeating, isn't it? The people who survived the worst events are rarely the strongest or the luckiest in any simple way. They are often just the ones who kept doing the small, stubborn, unglamorous things long after the sky gave them every reason to stop. There is one more thing worth sitting with. For over 1,000 years, this catastrophe was essentially forgotten. The late antique Little Ice Age, the worst environmental disaster of the last 2 millennia, had no name until 2016. It sat in plain sight, recorded by the very people who suffered through it, and we simply stopped listening. We treated Procopius and his dimmed sun as a strange old story, until the trees and the ice forced us to take him seriously again. That should make you wonder what else we've stopped listening to. How many warnings sit in old records, dismissed as exaggeration, waiting for the evidence to catch up? The people of 536 wrote down exactly what was happening to them. It took us 1,400 years to believe them, so the next time a winter feels long, remember that the word once meant something almost unimaginable. Remember that there were people who never once in their whole lives saw a normal sky, who were born into grey, and lived in grey, and died in grey, and still planted, still stored, still passed the seed grain to the next hand. You come from the ones who kept planting under a sun that gave light without warmth, who lived an entire life inside a winter, and made sure someone came after them anyway. The sky did eventually clear. It always does, but they had no way of knowing that. They kept going in the dark, on nothing but the refusal to stop, and that refusal is the reason there was ever anyone left to remember them at all.